everyone, it's Alexander, the real Mr. Robinson. So yesterday, The Rise of Skywalker came out on Blu-ray, and I realized when I was doing a bunch of Star Wars related videos in prep for The Rise of Skywalker, and even when I did my reviews for that movie, I realized I never once touched upon the big question, or the big claim that everyone has in terms of the sequel trilogy. Was the sequel trilogy planned? I was actually kind of surprised that I never mentioned that question at all, and if I agree with it. So now that The Rise of Skywalker is out on Blu-ray, and you can get the entire Skywalker saga on Blu-ray, I figure that now would be the best time to talk about whether or not I agree with this statement, as well as give you my thoughts on what could have been Episode 9 in the form of Colin Trevorrow's Duel of the Fates. And it's important I talk about what could have been with Episode 9 because that kind of feeds into my feelings on the sequel trilogy as a whole. To answer the main question right now, was the sequel trilogy planned? With the movies that we ended up getting in the sequel trilogy, The Force Awakens, The Last Jedi, and The Rise of Skywalker, no, I don't believe the sequel trilogy had a plan. But I feel like if Duel of the Fates had been the movie that we had gotten, then there would have been some kind of roadmap. Because let's look at things from the timeline of when the sequel trilogy was in development. The Force Awakens came out in December of 2015, and J.J. Abrams was named as director in 2013. Then the next year, in 2014, Rian Johnson was named as the director of Episode 8, and then in August of 2015, 2 months after the release of Jurassic World, Colin Trevorrow was announced as the director for Episode 9. So they had these 3 directors ready to go for each of their own movies. And I feel like if things had just stayed the course, and Colin Trevorrow had not been fired and replaced with J.J. Abrams, and Disney hadn't been in panic mode, then the fate of the sequel trilogy actually could have been a lot different than it is now. Which leads into my feelings on what could have been Episode 9 with Star Wars Duel of the Fates. When The Rise of Skywalker came out, and I saw it twice, I felt very disappointed that it was the movie we ended up getting because it just felt underwhelming. It felt like Disney or J.J. Abrams just kind of mashed together a bunch of things that fans wanted to see. It just didn't really feel creative. It just felt like a bunch of homages. And I never liked going down the path of, if I made this movie, this is what I would have done. But I really fell down that rabbit hole in the stuff I would have done as opposed to what Rise of Skywalker eventually ended up doing. And then when Colin Trevorrow's script leaked and we saw all this concept art, I looked at all of that and went, why couldn't Episode 9 have been this? Ultimately, there's no real way to tell if this movie would have been better than what we actually got because this movie doesn't exist. But just based on the stuff that I've read and all of the different ideas that Duel of the Fates presented, I feel like it might have been a better movie than The Rise of Skywalker. And if nothing else, it would have felt like a very fresh Star Wars movie that doesn't depend on countless homages to the original trilogy. Because here's some of the stuff that Duel of the Fates presents that would have made it a pretty interesting Star Wars movie and shows that Trevorrow was building upon what The Last Jedi did. For one, Palpatine is not in this movie except for a hologram. 2, Rey is not a Palpatine or doesn't claim to be a Skywalker, and she wields a double-edged lightsaber similar to her staff. Rey and Kylo Ren's duel is on Mortis, which was featured in the Clone Wars. There's a First Order occupation in Coruscant, and that's where the big finale of the movie would have taken place. The First Order and Kylo Ren are the main villains of the film and would not have been eclipsed by Palpatine or the Sith fleet. Rose would not have been sidelined throughout the entire movie and would have gone on another adventure with Finn, who ultimately leads a rebellion of First Order stormtroopers who had the same feelings that he had in The Force Awakens. And there's a bunch of other really cool ideas that really shows that Colin Trevorrow dug deep into Star Wars lore and expanded upon stuff that was introduced in the Clone Wars, Rebels, and again, he built upon what Rian Johnson established with The Last Jedi. Because I've seen The Force Awakens and The Last Jedi back-to-back twice. The first time was right before I went to see The Last Jedi on opening night. And the second time was right before the Rise of Skywalker press screening. And both times I've seen these movies back-to-back, I never got the impression that Rian Johnson disregarded everything that J.J. Abrams set up. The reason I say that is because as much as I love The Force Awakens, there wasn't that much introduced in that movie. There were just snippets of things to come, and it was just a more standard Star Wars movie. The goal of The Force Awakens was to get the franchise back on track, and I think J.J. Abrams did a fantastic job with that movie. And with The Last Jedi, Rian Johnson took what J.J. Abrams gave him and built upon that. And there's nothing about it that disrespects what J.J. Abrams established. J.J. Abrams was the one that put Luke on Ahch-To, and who made Luke vanish off the face of the galaxy after the fall of Ben Solo. That wasn't Rian Johnson's doing. And I know it's been well documented that J.J. Abrams gave Rian Johnson concepts for what Episode 8 could be, and Rian Johnson just threw them out. To me, that's not an argument for why you think The Last Jedi is terrible. Because to me, that's almost like if Ridley Scott had approached James Cameron with concepts on how an Alien sequel should be, and James Cameron threw him out. The Last Jedi was not J.J. Abrams' movie to make. It was Rian Johnson's. And for me, The Last Jedi built upon what The Force Awakens established, and took it in a way where we didn't know what was going to happen. It was an unpredictable ride. And with all the stuff that I've read for Duel of the Fates, it seems like Colin Trevorrow would have done that same thing, just built upon what Rian Johnson established. So in that aspect, if Duel of the Fates had been the Episode 9 that we got, then I really feel like that there was some sort of plan, that all three of these directors were working together to build the sequel trilogy. However, all that exists in an alternate universe that I wish I could go to, because with what I saw in The Rise of Skywalker, and having more time to think about it, it really does feel like a mishmash of stuff that J.J. Abrams and Disney thought would appeal to fans. Because not only does The Rise of Skywalker disregard a lot of The Last Jedi, but it even disregards a lot of stuff that J.J. Abrams himself established in The Force Awakens. There was no hint of Palpatine's return in The Force Awakens at all. Palpatine, as far as we were concerned, was still dead. At the end of the day, The Rise of Skywalker just feels like a big mishmash of nods, references, and homages that would appeal to fans. And it's a movie that's so safe, so predictable, it lacks surprises, there are no consequences at all. It just ends the sequel trilogy on a whimper. It reminds me very much of The Dark Knight Rises, where you had two really great movies to start out with, and then you get to this third movie where no one's heart was really in it. Sure, there is some good stuff in The Rise of Skywalker, like the lightspeed skipping scene. I still enjoyed that. John Williams' score is still very good as well, and the Rey and Kylo Ren connection that was established in The Last Jedi is taken to another level in The Rise of Skywalker, and they do some really inventive stuff. But on a whole, it just feels like there was no passion put into this movie at all. And for that, I have to agree with people that the sequel trilogy had no plan, because they panicked with the last movie rather than just going with their gut and going full speed ahead. It honestly makes me appreciate the prequels even more, because when you look at the prequel trilogy, there are little things in there that just do not work for me. For example, Anakin Skywalker building C-3PO. Jar Jar Binks being the one that gives emergency power to Palpatine, which kicked off the Clone Wars and eventually the Galactic Empire. Boba Fett being a clone of another bounty hunter. Yoda knowing Chewbacca. All that stuff doesn't work for me, but at the very least, in terms of the grand scale of the story, George Lucas knew where he was going. He knew that the point of the prequel trilogy was to show us how Anakin became a Jedi and how he fell to the dark side and became Darth Vader. It had a very clear path on where this story was going to end, and even though a lot of it doesn't work, it does provide with some very interesting concepts. And going back into the discussion of Colin Trevorrow, after seeing The Rise of Skywalker and all of Trevorrow's plans for his Episode 9, I have a much bigger appreciation for Jurassic World Fallen Kingdom. There is still a lot in that movie that I really dislike and I think is just downright idiotic and stupid. But at the very least, Jurassic World Fallen Kingdom ended in a way where the next movie was going to be drastically different. It was going to be a very interesting movie. And it would be very funny if whatever Trevorrow has planned for Jurassic World Dominion ended up being a better and more coherent finale to the Jurassic World trilogy than The Rise of Skywalker was for the entire Star Wars sequel trilogy. And if I could pull up some other examples of series where the creators knew how the story was going to end, let's look at the Harry Potter series. Despite how many retcons J.K. Rowling wants to come up with after the books and the movies have come out, she still knew where her story was going to end, and it's just a matter of getting there. And then you look at the Marvel Cinematic Universe. There were quite a handful of things that got changed in the middle of the MCU leading up to Endgame. For example, Spider-Man Homecoming and Ant-Man and the Wasp were not a part of the original Phase 3 lineup. Inhumans was cut altogether. Release dates for certain movies were changed around, but they still had a plan on where they wanted to go with this grand story. And they never chickened out or panicked in the middle of doing it. If one thing didn't work, they just moved on and tried to fix it in a future movie. And that's ultimately the problem with The Rise of Skywalker, is that this whole sequel trilogy, had it stayed the course, had the movies had been The Force Awakens, The Last Jedi, and Duel of the Fates, I think the sequel trilogy could have been a lot of fun. Maybe not as great as the original trilogy or the Clone Wars, but still would have been really good. But because they changed directors with Episode 9, and because they panicked due to the fan backlash of The Last Jedi, which I still think is the best Disney Star Wars movie, the sequel trilogy just went off the rails and fell into a ditch. I strongly believe that if Duel of the Fates had been the Episode 9 that we had gotten, the sequel trilogy would have had some sort of plan. So those are my opinions on whether or not the sequel trilogy was planned. But that being said, as much as I dislike The Rise of Skywalker, as much as it ended the sequel trilogy on a very sour note, I have no bad blood. I still am excited for a bunch of Star Wars stuff. I'm excited to see what all these other actors do within the future of their career. We know that Oscar Isaac and Adam Driver are going to have great careers going forward, but I'm more curious to see what John Boyega and Daisy Ridley are going to do in terms of their careers. And I'm even excited to see what else J.J. Abrams does in the future, because I still think he's a very talented director. But this is the movie that really made me understand what everyone meant when they say, he can't stick a landing. There's ultimately no way to know if Duel of the Fates would have been better than The Rise of Skywalker, but just based on what we've seen, I feel like Duel of the Fates could have been a great capper to the sequel trilogy. So those are my thoughts. Now I want to hear from you guys if you think the sequel trilogy had a plan or they had no plan. Also, what are your thoughts on all the concepts for the scrapped Episode 9? Whatever they may be, let me know in the comments below. And until next time, I hope you enjoyed this video. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel, give this video a like, leave a comment, support my Patreon page, follow me on social media, and until then, this is The Real Mr. Robinson telling you there is only one.